Hello, today we're going to talk about the K2 Science of Reading and really focus in on those evidence-based moves of phonics. You'll notice for this slide deck that there is a tiny URL so you can access those slides. And the reason that you might want to access the slides is that there is a digital note-taking sheet down here in the notes of the first slide. So go ahead and grab that tiny URL and that note-taking sheet if you are interested, and we can get started. So for this learning today, this is a continuation of the learning that we've been doing for several years now when it comes to the science of reading in primary grades, specifically looking at phonics instruction. This process began many years ago when we were looking at our system-wide data and we're wondering what we could do to further increase student performance and ability to read. We started with looking at consensus around beliefs. Do we all believe that we can get all students to read at high levels? And our system said, yes, we do believe that. So then we polled teachers' knowledge. Where do you feel like you have the strongest knowledge? And in K2, phonics was an area that rose to the top. Over the past couple of years then, we've been going into classrooms and collecting data on implementation. We have so many things to celebrate as our system. In those observations, we also found one or two areas where we could continue to sync up and calibrate, basically. And that is the stimulus for these particular slides. We looked at where we had different areas in our system where some of that vertical calibration could be helpful and put these slides together to provide the opportunity to have some of those conversations. So our outcome for this session is that we want to look at refining our knowledge and implementation of the moves of effective phonics instruction. We really are at the refinement level. As we go through the slides, you may notice that there are many things that you already have affirmed in your practice that you are already doing very well in alignment with these evidence-based moves. Hopefully through our conversation, you'll find maybe one or two small little things that you can maybe tweak or reach out to your teammates to continue to calibrate on as we all grow in refining that knowledge. Before we get too far into our session, it's always a good idea to activate your background knowledge. Hattie talks about how there's a very strong effect size for either self-questioning or quizzing so that we can really think about what we already think we know about a topic and then make connections to new learning. So I want you to take a minute and think about what is everything you can recall from the criterion and essential components that are listed on the phonics tool. Remember, the phonics tool has several different columns, with that first column just listing those big criterion and the column next to it having more specific bullets that describe the moves of how to implement those criterion with efficiency and in alignment with the research. So take a minute to pause the video, jot down some notes, and think about what are all the things that you remember about evidence-based moves for phonics instruction. When you have those notes done, you can go ahead and resume the video. Go ahead and pause now. Welcome back. Hopefully you were able to identify several of those components that are listed on the phonics tool, and now we can just continue to build upon them as we go through the next couple of slides. The way that this session is going to work is that I took the phonics tool and basically we're going to break down each one of those different criterion over this video and the next video. So the first thing that we want to do is tackle this idea of activating the phonological processor. Within this criterion, the essential component mentions that students engage in brief activities that help them to hear the phonics pattern of focus before seeing it in print. There are two things I wanted to highlight for this section. The first is just that idea of brevity. When we think about this tool in particular and the role of the phonological processor, what we're really just trying to do is hear the sounds of that pattern, activate that part of the brain, so that then when we get to the next section of actively teaching the pattern, kids will already have a hook upon which to hang that print learning. So it doesn't need to be long, perhaps just a minute or two, but what it does need to be is very tightly tied to the pattern of focus. We want to make sure that we are providing them words that have that pattern, that let them manipulate or work with that pattern orally first before we provide it in print. Now we know that in primary grades, it probably takes more than just 1 or 2 minutes of PA activities to develop that phonological processor. So that's not to say that this is the only PA work that you can do, particularly when we think about kindergarten and maybe into first grade. But for this tool, during this part of your reading instruction, we're really thinking about brevity and connection. For other parts of your day, as you're doing distributed practice or transitions, you're welcome to do much more phonological work to help strengthen that processor. So we talked about brevity, 1 to 2 minutes. Let's dig more into that idea of hearing the pattern of focus. When we first started learning about PA, and when we were looking at the National Reading Panel, they presented several different components of instruction as separate pillars. So PA was a separate pillar, phonics was a pillar, vocabulary was a pillar, comprehension was a pillar, fluency was a pillar. And that, in a way, seemed to communicate that idea that each one of these skills was equal in merit to skill and drill in their own right. However, as we've learned more about PA, we realize that its role is to support print learning, and therefore skill and drill in PA alone, without any connection to letters ever, really does not help kids. I mean, if you imagine you're walking down the street, you don't see any proficient adults hopping around, stretching out the sounds, g, without then using it in some capacity to read and write. So for us, when we are talking about PA, we really want to have kids manipulate and work with those sounds, but then bring those sounds to print so they see the utility of stretching the sounds apart in order to write the sounds, or blending the sounds together in order to read a word. So really that role is to sensitize students to that alphabetic principle, that idea that letters and letter combinations are represented by speech sounds, and that is our job for PA to help them to tease apart those speech sounds so they can put those letters on top of them. So through that mindset, that might affect how you're choosing what PA task to do for each one of your phonics patterns. Before I go on any further, I want you to take a minute to pause and think about each one of the patterns that you teach. What is unique or challenging about that pattern? So for example, when you first introduce letters to students, why is that hard for them? Or when you go from CVC to blends, what's new in that pattern of word? What might be tricky for them? Take a second to think about the patterns you teach, pause the video, and make note about what makes each one challenging, and then think through the lens of what you could do with a PA task that might help scaffold or make that just a little bit easier when you actually get to teaching the print pattern. Go ahead and pause now and resume when you're ready to hear the answers. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and talk through each one of these patterns and what makes it challenging, and that'll help us to think about how we can use PA to overcome that challenge. So when we think about letters, this is a brand new concept for kids. Everything that they've had in language up until this point has been whole units of meaning, words. And so now when we teach them letters, what we're teaching them is that what they internalized as a single unit, the word cat, is actually composed of 3 separate sounds, k, a, t. And each one of those sounds is represented by a different and unique letter. So for letters, what we really want kids to be able to do is just start to identify the letter and the sound that goes with it. It's just that very foundational skill of realizing our language is made up of smaller pieces than they realize, and each one of those pieces has its own sound. So that means when you're working on those identification tasks at the letter level, it could be telling kids, today we're going to focus on the sound s. Whenever I say the sound s, I want you to say back the sound s as well. If I don't say the sound s, I want you to go ahead and shake your hand to signal no. And then you progress through and list different sounds. S, and the kids would repeat s. And then you say p, and the kids would signal no. You would say and the kids would signal no. And then s, and they would signal s. So it's really helping them just to identify and attend to the letter sound. As we go from letters to CVC words, what's new and challenging for them there is that now they have to take these discrete units of sound that they can identify and either segment them apart or blend them together to either read or write words. So in order to help kids with this task, we really want them to orally first just work on that blending and segmenting, taking sounds without having the letters there to confuse them, and work on putting those sounds together or taking them apart. We also know in the CVC pattern, one of the most challenging parts is that vowel sound. So you could do identification tasks where you just ask kids to really focus in on what is the vowel sound in this word. It could be matching tasks, like here are the words cat and can. Do they have the same sound? You could do segmenting and blending and then have them just come back and tell you that vowel sound. You could play games like which word doesn't belong. There's lots of different ways you can do it, but it's about focusing their attention on the challenging part of the word. As you move from CVC to blends, what's challenging there is now you're adding another sound. You're going from a 3-sound word to a 4-sound word. So for PA, what could really support them is continuing to work on blending and segmenting, because now they have more sounds to blend and segment. You could continue to work on identification, but this time what you're going to work on identifying is that medial sound in the blend, the second sound in an initial blend, or the first sound in a final blend. So like in the word jump, the because that's really tricky for you to hear and feel. Or in the word trick, or slip, I guess is probably a better one. Trick is just a hard one with how we pronounce it anyway. In the word slip, it's really focusing on that l sound because it's hard. It hides from our mouth. You can also do addition and deletion tasks. I can say lip. Now I'm going to add s to the beginning, and I realize I've made the word slip. So all of those are very intentional ways to bridge kids from the 3 sounds of CVC to the 4 sounds of blends. You'll notice that that's what we actually have in our scope and sequence now anyway. So you're probably already doing that. What we're trying to do is really develop the understanding of why we're doing that. So you can be intentional with picking the patterns and the drills that you do and the words that you include. So now let's think about making that jump from blends to digraphs. Digraphs often go back to 3 sounds, so that's not the challenge. What's the challenge with digraphs is now again we're inserting brand new sounds that they haven't really attended to before. They just got comfortable with all the letter sounds, thought that they knew all the individual sounds of our language, and now we're telling them there's a whole nother set of sounds that they hadn't ever attended to before. And it's tricky because that sound, that single sound, is being represented by 2 letters. So it's a brand new concept that 2 letters could work together and still only produce 1 sound. For digraphs then, what you might really want to focus on is that sound and how that sound is unique or different than other sounds. So there are certain digraphs that sound more similar than others. For example, sh and ch sound very similar. So doing specific tasks that put sh and ch words together and having kids identify if it's a sh sound or ch sound could be helpful. The same goes for f and th. Very similar. In fact, without actually seeing my mouth, you may not really hear a difference at all. So helping kids to really attend to how is our mouth moving, what is that sound, and that identification level. That doesn't mean that you can't still be sounding and blending and adding and deleting all those other skills, but you might choose to add on this additional identification layer for digraphs so you can really attend to that sound and what makes that sound tricky or confusing compared to other sounds. Now I lumped VCE, R-controlled, and vowel teams all together because they all do something unique. They all bring in a new vowel sound. So all the other patterns we've talked about so far have been a short vowel sound. But now we're going to introduce a long vowel sound or a different vowel sound. Because we're introducing a new vowel sound, we could continue to work on identification, really thinking about what sound we hear, and in some cases, where we hear that sound. But we could also work on substitution tasks. We could start with a short vowel sound word, have them switch it to a long vowel sound, and see if they can produce the new word. Now, once they've done this, they've gotten through all of those single syllable work. It should seem like multisyllabic work would be a breeze. The thing that's challenging there is now we just have much longer words. And in those much longer words, we're bringing in multiple different patterns for them to attend to. So what we want to do is bring it back to something familiar. And to do that, we might be doing drills that are syllabication focused. That doesn't mean that we're actively teaching kids how to syllabicate. That has long since come and gone in our scope and sequence. We are using syllabication as a scaffold to help them to be able to break these long words apart so that then we can do other tasks like those vowel identification tasks and really attend to what makes each syllable unique. So these are probably the types of drills that you're doing anyway, but it's really thinking through the lens of why are we doing this specific task at this specific time with this specific set of words, so that you can leverage the sounds in order to make the print learning a little bit easier. So that wraps up the section on that connected PA warm-up. Again, we review that idea of it being brief, just 1 to 2 minutes, and really emphasize that importance of connection, using the sounds to scaffold and make the print learning easier. That then leads us into our second section of our phonics tool, which is where we do explicitly introduce and review the phonics pattern of focus. In this section, we're using academic language, we're reinforcing the learning of the pattern using visuals, and we're checking for understanding of that pattern. What we're really going to focus on for this time is that idea of using academic language and the continuity of our academic language across our building, as well as how we check for understanding. Now, when we did this task with our PLCs, what we really worked on here was just a calibration conversation. Unfortunately, I can't replicate with that U right here just all by our own. I do have a reference document listed there that you could click into, as it gives just some general language that might be appropriate for your building as we talk about these patterns. I can speak to some of the trends that we noticed across buildings. In most buildings, all of K2 was using both CVC and the closed syllable name for that pattern. So they were teaching both. And the rule for that pattern is that when there is one vowel followed by one or more consonants, it is a closed syllable and it has the short vowel sound. For blends, we really talked about how there are two consonant letters that can either occur before or after the vowel. And with a blend, each one of those consonants still produces its own sound. You can blend them together, kind of slide them together, and after teaching them as their own unique sounds, unitize them so they realize that the BL blend says bull. But you do always want to make sure to first introduce them as being their own sounds. Kids have to know that these aren't something you have to memorize all on their own. They are individual letters blending together. A digraph, on the other hand, is different. With a digraph, there are two consonant letters, and they are working together to make only one sound. You cannot physically separate them apart, and often that digraph is a totally different sound than either one of the consonant sounds. Some people with digraphs use hand signals to help reinforce that, perhaps two pointer fingers coming together to show two letters working together to make one sound, or the pointer and middle finger side by side so that, again, it references two letters working together to make one sound. The next pattern probably had the most diversity in language. We have heard anything from VCE, long vowel silent E, bossy E, magic E, and so on. In most buildings, we kind of settled on that idea of calling it silent E, with some variation about whether or not they were going to add in that VCE component as well. If you are choosing to continue to use things like bossy E or magic E, you may want to sync up with your team to see if that is the consistent language that you are using. The rule for this pattern is when you have one vowel followed by one consonant and an E at the end of the syllable, that vowel is going to have the long vowel sound and the E is not going to produce a sound at all. So when we're listening to words, we're listening for a long vowel sound somewhere in the middle of the syllable followed by a consonant sound. The hand signal for this is your pointer finger and middle finger held up in the shape of a V to show that separation between the vowel, a space for the consonant, and the E. The next pattern people will use pretty universally, either vowel R or R controlled, probably with R controlled being a little bit more popular. In this pattern, the sound is really contingent upon the vowel R pattern. So most people were teaching, if it's ER, IR, UR, it says OR says OR, AR represents R. For vowel teams, and the hand signal for that one is when you take your middle finger and wrap it around your first finger, kind of like you're crossing your fingers, because that vowel sound, or that letter R, is wrapping around the vowel and changing its sound. The next pattern is the vowel team pattern. For the vowel team pattern, it's much like a digraph. Two vowel letters this time, working side by side together to represent a different sound. It's not always a long sound, it could be a different sound, so we just want to teach them that when two vowel letters are side by side working together, they can produce a different sound. And again, here you have to be specific with just teaching each pattern and the sound it represents. I pulled out 3 additional specific patterns just because there's a couple things to highlight. With OI-OY or AI-AY, both of those have a positional aspect to the rule as well. Both OI and OI represent the OI sound, but OI tends to appear in the middle of the word, like boil. OY tends to appear at the end of a syllable, like boy. Of course, there's caveats to that, like when you add an S on there to make it plural. But it's a good rule of thumb to introduce at least that most commonly, OI is in the middle of a syllable, OY is at the end. Same for AI and AY. Both say A, but AI tends to be in the middle of the syllable, AY at the end. ER, IR, and UR are just tricky, and it's just, you have to acknowledge it's tricky with kids. They all say They could all happen at different places, typically at the end of that syllable. And for this one, about the best thing I can recommend is ER tends to happen just a little bit more, in particular because it's a suffix like teacher. And so try ER first when writing words, but then you just have to look at it. If it doesn't look like how you would see it as a reader, then try one of the other ones. There's not much else you could do for that. So I highly recommend that you think through what is your language of these particular patterns and rules, and then sync up with your team. Do they teach it in the same way? Is there anything we could do to calibrate and bring our language in closer proximity to one another so that kids have that consistent experience across their education? The other part that I wanted to highlight when it comes to explicitly teaching the pattern is how do we check for understanding of the pattern? So I brainstormed 3 possible word lists that you could use across this planning tool. These could be words that you use when you're explicitly teaching the pattern and you're just asking, is this a pattern word? Thumbs up, thumbs down. These could be words that you're using when encoding or decoding. So there's lots of places where you could embed these words. What do you notice is different about each one of these 3 word lists? You probably noticed that in this word list, everything is just the AY pattern, versus this one has mostly AY patterns, but you also have 2 closed syllable words that are going to have the short vowel sound instead of the long A sound. In this one, we still have mostly AY long A sounds. However, we also have the vowel consonant E pattern, so it's reviewing a past taught long vowel sound. And then we still have one non-example of the short vowel sound. Now, there's nothing to say that any one of these lists are more or less right, or that they're better or worse than others. Each one of these lists potentially has their own strengths and possibly their own negatives or cons that we may want to mitigate if we're choosing to use it. So for example, in this list, kids are seeing high repetition of the pattern. They're not going to get confused. They know exactly what they're working on, A spelled AY at the end of the word. A con to this pattern, though, and I've seen it, is sometimes our smart little students will just go ahead and write the pattern down on their board over and over, AY, 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 and then they don't actually have to attend to the pattern at any point. They're just focusing on that initial sound. And so that doesn't really reinforce the pattern learning that we're hoping for. So that's something to keep in mind, high repetition, but watch to make sure that kids aren't over-applying the pattern without thinking. This helps to mitigate some of that because now they really do have to listen. Does it say A, or is it a short vowel sound? So that seems like a great improvement. But the downside here again is that it only presents the A sound as the AY pattern, and we know that we've taught them other ways to represent the A sound. So they may start to overgeneralize and think that anytime a word says A, they have to use AY. This pattern is by far the most complex. Kids have to listen, is it the short vowel sound, or is it the long vowel sound? And then they have to listen, where does that sound occur? Does it occur at the end of the word, or does it occur in the middle of the word? And how does the spelling pattern change based on where the sound occurs? Now, the downside to this list is that it could definitely confuse kids who are not secure on their patterns. They may not know, am I practicing the AY, the vowel consonant E, the closed syllable, and then they may practice wrong. And we know that when you practice wrong, that reinforces misconceptions, and it takes a long time to break those misconceptions. So all of these patterns potentially have something really good to them, and they all have something for you to be aware of that may be a downside that you would have to mitigate. There's nothing to say that you have to use the same word list across all of your instruction either. Maybe early on in your instruction, you need a word list like this, where we're really just reinforcing the pattern. But as instruction continues, maybe you increase more non-examples and have those non-examples not only focus on sound, but also spelling patterns. This would give kids a nice range of experience, so they're really trying to transfer those skills. So that's the end of our first session. We really want to just pause and chew on that little bit of learning. We focused on the activating the phonological processor and thinking about how that's only 1 to 2 minutes long and definitely connected to the pattern of focus. We also talked about explicitly teaching the pattern and how we need to make sure that we are using consistent academic language and that we're checking for understanding of the pattern using non-example word lists, but being very thoughtful about how we choose that non-example word list. Notice in that section there was also a little blurb about how we're making the pattern visual, but we saw that as a strength across our system. If you don't know for sure how you want to make the pattern visual, reach out to your team because they can help you as well. So think about those little tidbits that we talked about today and connect back to our learning target of refining our knowledge and implementation. What is one small thing that you might want to apply based on our conversation today? Look at an upcoming lesson and make that tweak right now to reinforce that learning. Then think about what is your plan for continuing that tweak going forward so it's a sustainable part of your practice. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to your instructional coach. I'm Jessie Ketchum, the K-12 Literacy Curriculum Lead. I am more than happy to help you with any of this, as is your coach. Thanks for listening.